We got introduced to Egyptian history last week talking about creation, and before we move on, let me say something about kind of the construct of the class and kind of how I do things. I learned when I started my master's program several years ago that usually what's put on the PowerPoint isn't important. So, you know, when you're in undergrad and you're in high school, you want to take all the notes because you're afraid that what's up there is going to be on the test. Basically, what I put on the PowerPoint is there for your benefit, but things that we talk about off the PowerPoint, that's the important stuff, okay? So we got introduced to ancient Egyptian history last week, like I said, with creation myths. We talked about 3 different creation myths, but really they're all one and the same. When you think about it, Egypt really does demand the fullness of the Old Testament. We said earlier Egypt is in power from 3000 BC to 30 AD, and that's, you know, roughly 3,000 years that they're in power. They are always the most powerful nation in the Old Testament. Now, there are always going to be others that are powerful that come in and have to deal with Israel and the children of Israel as such, but Egypt is always going to be the most powerful. And sometimes that's a really good thing. So, for example, when Abraham leaves his homeland and there's a famine, he goes to Egypt and he buys food. When Jacob and his sons, after they've sold Joseph into slavery, when there's a famine there, they go into Egypt to buy food because Egypt has the means by which they can get food. There are times where Egypt being in power isn't a good thing, and we might think about the Exodus in that particular regard. So understanding Egypt is really going to help us understand the Old Testament. I would argue that every time you hear the Lord talking to His people, usually making a promise or telling them who He is, He always says the same thing, doesn't He? I'm the Lord your God who did what? Who brought you out of the land of Egypt. Well, if Egypt wasn't a superpower, it might be kind of like, you know, if God was to talk to us today, you know, I'm the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Great Britain. Well, Britain's still a world power, but not nearly what they once were as a world power. Egypt is always going to be a world power in this particular context. When you think about the geography of Egypt, it's kind of backwards. And we talked about this, I think, briefly a few weeks ago, but it's really backwards when you talk about it. Egypt, one reason why they were able to exist for so long as a superpower is simply because there was no way to get in and conquer Egypt. When you go to the east, you have the Sinai Peninsula, and what do we know about Sinai? That's where they wandered for 40 years in the wilderness. It's called a wilderness for a reason, because there ain't nothing, right? Moses had to hit a rock to get water. So, you know, there's nothing there. When you go west, there's nothing there. It's all desert. The Nile provides cataracts, which are these ginormous waterfalls. And remember, the Nile runs south to north. So any invaders coming from the south would have to get through these cataracts. You couldn't leave water too much or else you would die because there's no way to get water outside of the Nile. And to the north, you have the Mediterranean Sea. One interesting thing about the ancient world is no ancient people, with the exception of the Greeks and the Philistines, were seafaring people. So when we read Jonah, for example, when Jonah leaves the Lord and he gets on a boat, the Bible says he literally paid his fare. He bought the boat ticket. Listen to me. The Jewish people in the Old Testament don't get on boats. Okay? So when we preach that and when we teach that and we talk about Jonah running away from God, that point really needs to be hit home, because what's he doing? He's literally going out of his way and facing one of his biggest fears to get away from God. So the Mediterranean Sea up here, no one's going to come in. But by the way, when the Greeks do come in and take over, how do they come? Through the Mediterranean Sea, because they're just right across the Mediterranean. Of course, the Nile made life possible in Egypt. If it wasn't for the Nile, nothing would be possible. The Nile, when it floods, it's very predictable how the Nile is going to flood. And so one of the chief roles of the Pharaoh, which we'll talk about the Pharaoh being God on earth, but one of the chief roles of the Pharaoh was to ensure the flooding of the Nile. Now, can you imagine going to sleep with that on your conscience, making sure that the Nile floods? I mean, how are you going to do that? But as the Nile floods, you have this nutrient-rich sediment, and it's going to flood and settle over the land, and then the waters are going to come back, leaving the sediment, and it's going to be basically fertilized soil that's there because of the flooding. Now, notice again that the Nile not only is good for farming, but it also made for easy travel, transportation, and communication. Now, notice we said that the ancient people aren't seafaring people, but that doesn't mean they're not used to riding in boats. The Egyptians used boats a lot, but they used freshwater boats, not really to go up and down the Nile, but to go from one side to the other. Okay, so every major city is built on a river, is it not? I mean, think about it. Nashville is built on the Cumberland River. Knoxville, Chattanooga, Memphis, they're all built on rivers. When you have a river, you have ease for transportation and communication. We said already that the Nile flows south to north, and because of your elevation, Upper Egypt is in the south, Lower Egypt is in the north. And we've, I think, ridden that horse till it won't ride anymore. We've talked about it so much. But it's very important for us when we think about Egypt and Upper and Lower Egypt, when they're divided, when they're united, geographically, how those things work. When they are united, the Pharaoh is called the Lord of the Two Lands, or the Nefer-Netcher Nesubiti, the ruler of the two lands. So he's going to be over all of this on both sides of the Nile. Egyptian society was basically like we would think of it today. At the top you have the Pharaoh, of course. But underneath the Pharaoh, I think, is where it gets interesting. I think I have this on the slide in our future tonight, so I'm sorry to get ahead of myself, but most of the documents and the hieroglyphics and all of that, most of what we can learn about ancient Egypt covers the Pharaoh, right? It's all written in his honor and about him and his family and his conquest. So Pharaoh and nobility make up about 10% of the population, which means that what we know about Egypt, we know about 10% of the population. I would have loved to have been a fly on the wall in ancient Egypt. I love ancient Egypt. I'm a huge nerd about it. I have a tie that's hieroglyphics. I have one of those face masks that we have to wear everywhere now that's hieroglyphics. I love ancient Egypt. And one reason is because if you can get into the minds of these farmers and slaves and these merchants and these craftsmen, and you could see what their daily life was like, I think it would just open up the Bible so much more. But of course at the top you have the Pharaoh, and then you have his governing officials and nobles and priests. And that being said, when we think about Joseph, and we will talk about Joseph tonight, he will fall in this category. But Joseph is not really a government official or a noble or a priest. And we'll talk about why he falls into that category, even though he doesn't fit in these subcategories a little bit later. Then you have the soldiers next, and then scribes. Now that's the way this particular pyramid hierarchy puts it. I disagree with that. I think the scribes would be over the soldiers, and I'll tell you why in a couple of slides. And then, of course, merchants and craftsmen. And then at the bottom here, you have farmers and slaves. Now, one thing about the slaves, in the ancient world, and by ancient world I mean the world of the Old Testament, slavery obviously exists. I mean, the children of Israel are slaves nonetheless. But pre that, I would suggest, from Genesis 11 with the Tower of Babel and the dispersal of people into the world, up until Egypt really becomes a superpower, this is the development of civilization, right? That people they're not being nomadic anymore. They're starting to build cities. You have places like Uruk and other places like Sumer coming together in Mesopotamia. And what you find there is that there are no slaves. The people work for the government because the government provides for them the things they need to live. Don't confuse that with socialism or communism, because it's not. What the government says is you can have this piece of land and you can work it and you can farm it to provide for yourself food if 2 weeks out of the year you'll come and bust your hind in for us building all these monuments and stuff, you see. Now, I believe personally that this is how the pyramids were built. I don't believe that the Jews built the pyramids. I think the pyramids were there long before the Jews were ever in Egypt. But I believe the Egyptians themselves built it. Now, how they built it, I don't know, aliens. But I don't think the Jews built it. Now, the Pharaoh obviously has the highest position, right? As such, the Pharaoh is often viewed as a representative of the gods and as a god himself. And this will continue on well into the time of Cleopatra, and they saw themselves as gods. We see this most notably in these inscriptions, these sculptures here. The first one is of Pharaoh Khafre, who you see here, what a handsome devil. But behind him is this falcon. The falcon is representative of the god Horus, and you recall from last week we talked about Horus a little bit. He's the 10th member of the Aeneid, which is the heavenly realm of the gods as they're created. He's the 10th god to be created. He's the son of Isis and Osiris. And he is this protector of the Pharaoh. Now, on the PowerPoint, it's a little bit difficult to see here, but you have the big falcon, obviously, with the crown of Upper Egypt. This is Horus, but what's hard for us to see is this little guy here, who is the Pharaoh. And you can see Horus there brooding over the Pharaoh Nectanebo II. So, unlike Mesopotamia, where the king was not usually treated as divine, the Pharaoh was thought to be a god. I find this interesting that when you look in Mesopotamia, and by the way, Mesopotamia is that area between Tigris and Euphrates, between the two rivers. When you look at their literature and how they viewed their kings, the best you get is semi-divine. Is anyone in here familiar with the Epic of Gilgamesh? Has anyone ever heard of that? You can get it almost at any dollar bookstore. It's an ancient Sumerian legend of a king named Gilgamesh who is semi-divine, kind of like Hercules. But that's about as close as you get. In Egypt, Pharaoh, he's God. And as such, you don't need these law codes. So in Mesopotamia, you have the Code of Hammurabi. I don't know if you're familiar with the Code of Hammurabi. It's very, very close to the Law of Moses. And a lot of people, it predates the Law of Moses, but a lot of people believe that Moses ripped off the Code of Hammurabi to make the Law of Moses. I don't believe that, but the law codes do match up very similarly. Well, you don't need a law code in Egypt because whatever the Pharaoh says as God goes. Right? And so we said earlier that the belief of the divine ruler extends even into the Roman period, as late as the Ptolemaic period. Now, Alexander the Great comes in and conquers everything, you recall, and in doing so, he Hellenizes everything. He makes everything Greek. Well, Alexander the Great dies, and then all of his empire is divided between the Ptolemies and the Seleucids. And so that's what we're talking about. So we're talking about the end of the Greek reign and the beginning of the Roman period here. Unlike Mesopotamia, the Egyptians do not rely much upon legal codes. We talked about that. However, the Pharaoh was expected to uphold the principles of Ma'at. Ma'at is the Egyptian word for truth and justice. Okay, so that's very important. When you die, and we'll see this, I think, in a couple of slides, but when you die in Egyptian mythology, your heart is weighed against the feather of Ma'at. It's the feather of truth and justice. Okay, so even though he's considered to be a god, he's still expected to uphold these principles. And all of his officials were to follow these concepts as well. We talked a couple weeks ago about the crowns and the significance of the crowns. If you were to go to an art museum or an ancient Near Eastern museum, you can tell who the pharaoh was based upon the crown. So this bowling pin looking thing here is the upper crown, the Hejjet, and then this kind of throne looking thing with a I call it an ant antenna, I don't know what it is the lower crown of Lower Egypt, the Deshret. And then, if you see the crowns combined, and that's kind of what they look like, if you see them combined, it's the Peshent, the double crown. Now, let's talk about how this impacts our reading of the Bible. In Exodus, Pharaoh seems to be treated like the other gods of Egypt. Well, he claims to be a god, so why not? Notice this. When God tells Moses he is going to Pharaoh and he's going to tell Pharaoh that the plagues are coming, let my people go, all that stuff, what does God tell Moses that he's going to do? He says, I will make you like what to Pharaoh? Does anyone remember? I will make you like a god, and Aaron will be your prophet. Okay? So, he doesn't say, I'm making you a god. He says, I'm making you like a god. And then what's the first thing Moses does when he shows up? He turns his staff into a snake and performs all these great miracles that clearly no human being could do. And Moses is showing himself there like a god. Not as God, but like a god. So Pharaoh is treated like all the other gods. And so the contest of the plagues is between Pharaoh and God, Yahweh. Notice Exodus chapter 12, verse 12. For I will pass through the land of Egypt this night, and I will smite all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, both man and beast, and against all the gods of Egypt I will execute judgment. I am the Lord. And by the way, when you see Lord, L-O-R-D, in all capital letters in our English Bibles, that is the covenant name of God, Yahweh. Okay? It doesn't mean Lord as in master. That's all lowercase. And our English Bibles do that because our Jewish friends find it very offensive to speak the covenant name of God. And so we try to be respectful of that as we translate the Hebrew. I hate that, just to be honest with you, because I'm a literalist. But notice he says, this is against all the gods of Egypt. And then in verse 29, at midnight the Lord struck down all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, from the firstborn of Pharaoh, who sat on his throne, to the firstborn of the prisoner who was in the dungeon, and all the firstborn of the livestock. So, what do you have? It's an attack against the gods, but we don't read about an attack against the gods. Or do we? Yes, we do. It's an attack against Pharaoh. All right? So understanding how Pharaoh and the Egyptians viewed him, I think really helps us understand the plagues a little bit better. By the way, what's the plague that comes right before the death of the firstborn? Does anyone remember plague number 9? Not hail. Not hail. Darkness. Darkness. Who's the sun god? Ra? Re? Whichever one you want to call him. He is the chief god of Egypt. And then there's darkness. Well, who's the next chief god? Pharaoh. And then Pharaoh can't even protect his own children. You see. We're not going to get really into a theological discussion about Pharaoh hardening his own heart or God hardening his heart. Another conversation for another time, and I probably need a nap and a couple ibuprofens to tackle that particular conversation. But I don't think that Moses includes it, because remember, Moses is an Egyptian-influenced person. Yes, he's a Hebrew. Yes, his mother nursed him. Yes, I believe that during those years that she was nursing him, she taught him the stories that we have written down in Genesis. I believe that. However, Moses grew up not in a Hebrew household, but in an Egyptian household. He lived with Pharaoh's daughter. You remember this. And so I believe that Moses grew up going to the Egyptian temples, that he grew up hearing the mythology just as much as he did the Hebrew. So, when we talk in Exodus about Pharaoh hardening his heart, I don't think that, or God hardening his heart or whatever, I don't think our minds should really say, well, does that mean that Pharaoh didn't have free will? No, I think it's Moses' way of showing his readers, who are also Egyptian immersed, that what was happening with Pharaoh is that he's coming below the level of Ma'at. of truth and justice. So here's a papyrus from the Book of the Dead. Are you familiar with the Book of the Dead? Have you ever heard of it? Anyone? Okay, it's all over the History Channel. They'll always have this new special about unlocking secrets from the Book of the Dead or whatever. So you have this guy, I think it's this guy, maybe it's this guy, who dies and goes into the underworld, and there's so much that you have to do before you can enter into paradise as it is. And one of those things is your heart, this thing right here is a human heart, is weighed against the feather of Ma'at, which is over here, this feather here, and by the god of the dead, Anubis. Anubis is the jackal-headed god, and one reason why they thought that was because when you have a dead animal or dead people, what do you do with them? You kind of throw them out of the camp, and around here we might call them a coyote, or a coyote. Well, that's why, because jackals hang around dead stuff. So he weighs the heart. If your heart is heavier than the feather of Ma'at, which means you had a bad life, you didn't uphold truth and justice, and you weren't a noble person, your heart is then fed to this lovely creature here, which is a crocodile, lion, hippopotamus. Now think about this. They live on the Nile. What are the three most dangerous animals you come in contact with in Egypt? A crocodile, a Nile crocodile, a lion, and a hippopotamus. I'd have never thought a hippopotamus would be as dangerous as they are. Those suckers will flat kill you. And they knew that, so they've made this composite creature who will eat the heart, and so you cease to exist, as it were. You just, there's no hell, you just cease to exist. So when we read that Pharaoh hardened his heart, or his heart became heavy, and there again is a kind of difference in translation. Is it that his heart became heavy? Is it that his heart was hard? Whatever. I think it's showing us that he's not upholding to the truth of Ma'at. Okay. Any questions so far? I know we're moving at the speed of light, it seems. Oh yes, absolutely. Yeah, you find, if you go into a pyramid or a tomb, you find this stuff all over the walls. It's funny, we tell our children not to write on walls, but thank goodness the Egyptians did. Yeah, absolutely. All right, let's rewind. We started with Pharaoh and Moses. Let's go back to Joseph. Now, Joseph, you recall, is sold into slavery by his brothers. He's taken to Egypt. He really rises to power in Potiphar's house. And then he has the incident with Potiphar's wife. He's thrown in jail. He rises to power in the jail. He becomes the second in the jail. And then he interprets dreams and wait a little while longer, and then his power is told to Pharaoh, and then he rises to second in power in all of Egypt, you recall. Now, remember what we said 2 weeks ago? An Egyptian would never, ever, 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 ever let a foreigner be second in power. And so if you put this on the timeline for our chronology that we know, the Egyptians actually aren't in power when Joseph rises to power. And I think you can prove that in 2 ways from Scripture. Way number 1 is what we just said, that an Egyptian would never allow a foreigner to rise that high in power. And number 2, when you read about Potiphar, we get this kind of parenthetical statement in Genesis. How is Potiphar described in Genesis? Don't overthink this. He's Potiphar the what? He's called Potiphar the Egyptian. Well, for its sake, you're in Egypt. So why do we have to take special time to call Potiphar the Egyptian when they're already in Egypt? Because not everybody in Egypt at this time were Egyptians. And the people in power weren't Egyptians. Okay? So we'll talk about that a little bit later, I'm sure. Notice what it said here, though, about Joseph. Pharaoh put his signet ring on Joseph's hand. I'm starting in the middle here. He arranged him in garments of fine linen and a gold chain around his neck, let him ride in the chariot second in command. Everyone had to bow in front of him. Moreover, Pharaoh said to Joseph, I'm Pharaoh, and without your consent no one shall lift up hand or foot in all of the land of Egypt. And Pharaoh gave Joseph a new name. He gives him an Egyptian name, Zaphanath-Paneah. And what you have here in this inscription is the vizier, or the advisor, whatever you want to call him, under Amenhotep, the third and the fourth. So what do you see here that's similar to the description of Joseph? Well, we can't really tell what kind of clothes this person is wearing, but you see the necklace, and you can't really see the signet ring either, but you can see these resemblance of gold chains. You've got a bracelet here, and also you see that there's the standard Egyptian garb and the little beard here, which was the marker of Egyptian royalty. So basically what I want us to gain from this slide is that the description of Joseph as this second in command, if it's made up, because remember, one of the reasons we study this is for apologetics. It's not the main reason, but it's one of the reasons. If this is made up, and someone wrote this hundreds of years after this was supposed to happen, y'all, it fits pretty doggone good into the context. So I don't have enough faith for coincidences. It fits really well. We said we were going to talk about scribes, and here we are. One reason why I believe scribes should be higher on the totem pole than the former slide of that pyramid says is because, first of all, not everyone could be a scribe. Scribes were not just men. There were men and women who also served as scribes, but not everyone could be a scribe. It took a long time to go to school to learn how to read and write and learn your hieroglyphs and all of that. But notice this image of a scribe. This is how they would write and study. They had to have a strong back. You know they did, sitting like that and writing on their lap. But what do you... Okay, I'm not an artist. And when someone shows me something and they say, what do you see here? It takes me a minute, okay, I promise. But what do you notice about this guy that's kind of different from what we've seen with other Egyptian inscriptions and renderings?
It's not royalty. Like most of the things that you see, they have gold.
Yeah.
Things like that. There's nothing about him.
He very modest looking, isn't he? As far as, well, I mean, maybe you should throw a shirt on to be modest, but he doesn't have the bling, let's call it. One thing that I noticed about him, he's kind of like me. He could stand to lose a few pounds. Don't you see here in his midsection, his chest? I mean, he's really got the weight. Why is that? Well, he's been no physical activity. He's sitting there writing and studying all day. But even one who sits and writes and studies, I mean, think about this. Prisoners of war are kept in a cell and they're skin and bone. Why is that? It's because they're not being fed. This guy is clearly being fed heavy rations. Okay? So what I want you to notice about him is that, and this is why I think he's higher on the totem pole than soldiers, because you don't get paid in the ancient world with money. Money doesn't exist. You get paid in food or clothing or whatever. He's obviously getting paid a lot because he has this excess body fat, and I don't think soldiers got that. I really don't. Most of our inscriptions and art and literature that we have from ancient Egypt were produced for the pharaohs and the officials, and of course we talked about this. That makes up about 10% of the population, so it would have been really interesting to see what the rest would have been like. And that, by the way, if you have any interest at all, and I don't know that you will, but if you do have any interest at all in studying Egyptology, or Mesopotamian studies or whatever. Most of the study that's being done today in those areas are not done about the pharaohs. I find I laugh when I get on my Disney Plus subscription and I look at National Geographic and they've got this new documentary on Tutankhamun. It's the same stuff. Most of the work in Egyptology now is being done trying to figure out who the everyday person was. And that to me is fascinating. Here's the chronology of ancient Egypt. You have basically three periods: the Old Kingdom, the Middle Kingdom, and the New Kingdom. Each of these kingdoms is separated by an intermediate period. Joseph comes to power in the second intermediate period. This is when the Hyksos, or the Hyksos, depending on how you want to pronounce it, invaders come in and take over. We say they took over, they really don't. They come in and they get in power, but they adopt Egypt as their lifestyle, and so Egypt kind of took them over by them taking it over. I don't know if that makes any sense or not, but this is around the time when Joseph would have been in power. And then the New Kingdom would be the Exodus. Upper and Lower Egypt are separated until this guy. This lovely man here is a pharaoh called Narmer. Now, what do you notice about him? What's he wearing?
He dressed of both.
Not of both.
Well, he got the one of the south mainly.
Yeah, that's right. It's Upper Egypt, which is south. You're right. Okay? So, there is his Upper Egypt, right? He's got a club in his hand. He's beating this poor person, probably someone he took over in battle. And he's trampling under the feet of these others. And you've got Horus here doing his job, and the bull inscriptions, which are signs of power. But then on the other side of this palette, this is one side, and this is the other side of the palette. On the other side of the palette, you have him again, and he's here. But instead of this headdress, you have the little ant antenna thing, and he's wearing the red crown. What does that mean? Well, he's the guy who's credited with bringing in Upper and Lower Egypt as one unified place. Okay? So you don't have the unified crown yet. It hasn't been developed. So on one side, he's wearing this crown. On the other side, he's wearing the other crown. By the way, this palette has kind of a dip right here where these two lion, monkey, dragon things are intertwining their necks, probably representative of Upper and Lower Egypt being unified. This whole thing, all this beautiful artwork, only has one purpose, and it's that hole right there. And the reason for that hole is that's how they made makeup. So we think we're so advanced with our technology, they were doing the same thing. Ladies, when you go to the store, you look at your color palette. It goes all the way back to ancient Egypt. How about that? Pyramids get a lot of attention. We won't give them very much attention tonight. But I want you to familiarize yourself with this because I think it helps us, especially when we get into the Exodus and we see the thought and the theology of the Egyptians. Why build the pyramids? There are three predominant theories right now. The first is that the pyramids served as a stairway into heaven, the stairway for the Pharaoh to enter the sky. And along with that theory, if you look at the triangle, as it were, it kind of resembles the sun's rays, and we'll see an inscription that is the reason people believe this. The second one, this is the one I buy into. I think it's to represent that primordial mound we talked about last week as it comes out of the waters of noon, and you have this creation mound. And I think that's what's going on here, but I don't get paid to think these things. And then to serve as a device for aiming the dead pharaoh toward particular constellations. I think you have to really read into that a whole lot to get there. We do need to give credit, though, to the Egyptians and Mesopotamians for their ability to keep the calendar and pay attention to the sky and look at constellations and things like that. By the way, in the Gospels, when Jesus is born, these magi who come, they're not believers in Yahweh. They're Zoroastrians. They study the sky and they study constellations, and they saw this star and they follow it. So credit where credit's due. Maybe they stopped being Zoroastrian after that. Who knows? So the first theory of the pyramid as the sun's ray, you see here's the sun, which is the solar disk of Ra, and you have it depicted here in this triangular form. You have, this is such an ugly picture, but you have these two individuals here who I believe are gods of some kind, and they're holding these humans like babies, but they're full-grown humans. Probably gods giving the humans up to the entryway into the sky, as the theory suggests. We'll skip over that. Then you have the creation mound. Again, we looked at the Benben stone last week, that black rock that's in that pyramid shape. Here's another. Just this pyramid shape, and you see the offering going up to the sun. I mean, the sun was everything. And notice this, that here you have the sun in this cradle. That's a boat. And the reason is, when you look up at the sky, we said the sky's blue, and they believe that was the ocean, or the waters, right? The upper waters. Well, when you see this ball of fire riding across that, how does something get across water? It rides in a boat. And so they believe that the sun was the god Ra, riding in his boat across the sky, and every night he would descend into the underworld. This, I'm not even going to dignify this by talking about it. I think this is so far-fetched of a theory, but anyways. All right, let's get back to our buddy Joseph. The Hyksos take over around 1650 BC. They are a dynasty of foreigners who arose in the eastern delta, and they take over Lower Egypt and hold it to 1540. Now, if you place the Exodus at, I'm trying to think, like 1525 or something like that, it makes very good sense that Exodus chapter 1 would say, and now there arose in Egypt a Pharaoh who did not know Joseph. Why did not he know Joseph? Because now you have an Egyptian Pharaoh as opposed to a foreign Pharaoh. You see, it's not that they just forgot about Joseph. It's that you have two completely different cultures in power over Egypt at this time. We call them the Hyksos. That's a Greek word. They're probably, well, I don't want to say that because I could be wrong. I was reading a book in preparing for this class, and the guy suggested that they were from the Amorites. That may be it, because the Amorites at this time are taking over a lot of civilizations, but who knows? We just call them the Hyksos. But like we said, they come in and they conquer Egypt, but really Egypt conquers them because they start dressing like Egyptians. They get immersed in Egyptian culture and Egyptian theology and mythology, and they start ruling like Egyptians. They start shaving like Egyptians. One interesting thing about the Egyptians, just by way of a side note, in today's world, again, not to be, we're talking culture here. I'm not trying to be, pushing my limits, but in today's world, women usually shave unwanted body hair like everywhere, like your legs, your underarms, whatever. In Egyptian society, it was the men. Men shave their bodies clean every day, with the exception of their beard. Okay, with that little stringy beard. They were bald, body hair was grotesque to them. So when you're looking at these inscriptions and you see someone who has a beard, a full beard, or long hair, they ain't Egyptian. I can promise you that. Ain't Egyptian.
What about that one we see in the movie The Ten Commandments, where they had that little string of hair that's sort of rolled, wrapped up, sort of like a ponytail?
Right, yeah, but the rest of his head's bald, right? So that's the marker of the prince. And then if you notice when, I think they do this in the Ten Commandments. It's been so long since I've seen it. I think when Moses gets older, he cuts it off and is completely shaven. because then you put your headdress on. So, but yeah, in talking about the Hyksos, they take this culture, right? It almost reminds you of what Alexander the Great does when he conquers. He turns everyone Greek. You know, he forces you to learn the Greek language. He forces you to dress like a Greek and talk like a Greek and act like a Greek. Well, the Hyksos, even though they took over, it's kind of the opposite effect. Egypt took them over. So after the Hyksos, in that second intermediate period, then comes the New Kingdom. And with the New Kingdom, you have this lovely gentleman, Amenhotep IV, who changes his name to Akhenaten. And you're probably familiar with him, you just don't know you are. Okay, so Akhenaten, as we'll call him, is kind of a weird dude. And you can see here in his inscription, even though this is kind of a bad picture, in his sculpture, he looks drastically different than the other pharaohs, doesn't he? He's got a very long, slender face. Again, I'm not trying to be vivid or anything, but we're judging this because that's... If you want someone to paint your picture, you better find someone who likes you, okay? Because they can make you look however they want you to. Well, his people didn't like him because he is responsible for making the nation of Egypt monotheistic. And when the nation of Egypt is monotheistic, everything goes downhill. There's famine, there's warfare, everything's just horrible. And the people blamed him. So the way this worked is that the people would worship him, and he and his wife would worship the gods. Or, well, not the gods, but the god, the one god that they kept. So I want to talk about his statue here. You have a very long, slender face. You've got the beard coming off here. You have very large, feminized lips. And then when you come down, you have what look like women's breasts here in his chest. The reason for that is most scholars today believe that this was not originally Akhenaten, that this was his mother. And no one wanted to make an image of him because everyone hated him. So they took images they already had and just kind of tweaked them. Okay? So I think seeing this kind of shows you, well, first of all, it shows us how monotheism in the ancient world was viewed. Not very good. It also shows us how emperor worship in the ancient world, we're familiar with emperor worship in the Roman world, but emperor worship, as it were, in the ancient world was viewed. So what Akhenaten does is he and his family worship the god Aten. You see the similarities in the name, why he renamed himself. His name literally means beloved of Aten. And all the people would worship him. And so we call this monotheism, but it's really not. Most scholars will agree that something drastic had to take place for him to even get the idea of monotheism. Can you think of an event that might have happened prior to this where one God is shown to be the true God? Absolutely. The plagues in the Exodus. So I buy into that theory. Not a lot of people do. But I think Akhenaten was... and by the way, Akhenaten is not the oldest child. He's the second oldest, and he becomes Pharaoh. Why? Because the first oldest died. Makes perfect historical sense to me. Okay? Let's see, I'm going to skip over this. We're coming close to the end. Okay, so when you get to the Exodus, actually I need to go back. When you get to the Exodus, there are two main ways of dating the Exodus. The first, and I had my date wrong earlier, I apologize for that, but The first is to put it in 1290. And so this is a later date that suggests that Akhenaten is influenced. Now, I think that the Exodus can have an early date and Akhenaten still be influenced. I don't buy into the late date. And actually, of all the things that we could disagree on, if you disagree on either one of these dates, it really doesn't make that big of a difference in the chronology of the Bible, which is interesting. But scholars also place the Exodus in 1447 BC, which is what I place it as, and they argue that the plagues demonstrate the impotence of the Egyptian gods, which I do, which lead to the Amarna Revolution. And we won't talk about the Amarna Revolution because we don't have time and we really don't need to. Who was the Pharaoh when the Exodus was happening? Who have you heard most notably was the Pharaoh? Ramses II. Okay? I want to challenge that theory. Now, if I wind up getting to the pearly gates and God says, nope, Ramses was it, I'd be like, all right. Good to know. I don't think it's really a matter of our salvation, but a lot of people believe that Ramses II is the Pharaoh, and the reason for that is when you come to Exodus chapter 1, we find that the Jews had built the cities of Pithom and Ramses, right? And so it just makes sense that Ramses would have been the king who named this city after himself. Ramses II was one of the oldest pharaohs to have ever lived. He claims to have had over 100 children. Bless his heart. Father's Day must have been a nightmare. And he dies around the age of 90, so he's very old when he dies. This is his tomb. One of the most famous places in Egypt is this tomb. You see the ginormous statues here, and you go in through the entrance. And here's kind of what it looks like on the inside. You were talking earlier about the wall inscriptions. There you go. All over these wall inscriptions. And you have these huge statues, and here, this is not his tomb, this is a temple, the Temple of Amun, but you have these humongous pillars that are written in hieroglyphs. And I don't know if you remember, because you've slept since then and I have too, but you know one hieroglyph. I've taught you one hieroglyph. It's this symbol right here. It's the sandal strap. It's called the Ankh. Does anyone remember what it means? I'd be shocked if you did. It means life. Life. And then here you have the symbol for Lower Egypt and the symbol for Upper Egypt. No, I'm sorry, Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt. This reed stalk in this mound, and then this bee, or this bug on this mound. Nesu Biti. So it's the life giver to Nesu Biti, the ruler and the life giver of Upper and Lower Egypt. So there you go. You just learned a hieroglyph. What are we going to do with the Exodus then? We're going to date it in the 13th century, or are we going to date it in the 15th century? There are three theories. The first is that the Exodus occurred in the 13th century, which would place it around 1290 because of Ramses and building the city of Ramses. If you've got the name, it has to be named after somebody, right? Well, the second theory is from our liberal friends who say that the Jews were never actually in Egypt, and they created this story to show the formation of their religion and their nation, and it's all just made up. It's a myth. As a matter of fact, this will blow your mind. Most Jews today believe the Exodus is a myth. Most Christians believe it's factual. Most Jews believe it's a myth. And I'm sitting here thinking over and over and over again, you don't even accept the New Testament. Over and over again in your Old Testament scriptures it says, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, and you think it's made up. You atheist? Get out of here. But then there's a theory of the 15th century, and this is the one I buy into, and I'll tell you why. This view argues that the date of the Exodus should be determined by accepting the dates in 1 Kings 6:1, which Solomon began to build the temple in 967 BC, which occurred 480 years after the Exodus, and also Judges 11:26, as Jephthah referred to the Israelites as being in the land for 300 years. So you do the math, that's what pops up. Now what do we do about Ramses? Well, this view contends that Ramses was not the Pharaoh at the date of the Exodus, which I don't think he was, but I do think, though, that one of two things is happening. Number one, the name was used already. My name is Joshua Seth. How many times has the name Joshua Seth been used in ancient history? Well, at least twice, because we read about it in the Bible. Okay, so, I mean, it's out there. Just because something is named something doesn't mean it has to be named after one particular person. And the second reason, though, I think is more probable. We can agree that the Bible, as it's been passed down, and we have examples of this in Scripture, Ezra takes the Pentateuch and he edits the Pentateuch. I don't think he changed it, but he edits it, right? Well, if in Ezra's day, that area was known as Ramses, but before that it was known as something else, if Ezra changes the name, is he changing Scripture? No. He's just letting it be more readable. He's letting his audience understand where it is. And I think that's what's happened here. I think it refers to the same place by a different name. Okay? This is the last slide and we'll be done. So, the end of Egypt. When Alexander the Great defeats the Persians in 332 BC, he gains control of Egypt. So, even though he gains control of Egypt, you'll recall Egypt doesn't stop having a pharaoh until 30 AD. So, 380 more years, there's still a pharaoh. Egypt, after Alexander the Great, passes into the hands of Ptolemy I, which is one of Alexander's generals. And then ultimately Octavian, who, by the way, who is Octavian? What do we know? He's Caesar who? The first Caesar of Rome. It is Augustus. Yep. Octavian. Okay, here's how it goes. It's Octavius, then Octavian, then Augustus. That'll keep you up at night. When he defeats Mark Antony and Cleopatra, Egypt then becomes a province of Rome. And so the year 30 BC, that says BC, I think it's AD actually, is usually considered the end of ancient civilization. So Egypt is the longest lasting ancient civilization known to man. Period. 3,000 years. Egypt is always a superpower in the Old Testament. Egypt can be a blessing. Egypt can be a curse. And God works, I believe wholeheartedly that God works in the lifestyle and in the context of the people that He's speaking with. And so us understanding a little bit about them, as we've said every class, and I'll continue to say, us understanding a little bit about them will help us understand the Bible a little bit better.